You
right
got
there.
Obama's picture on the
No,
wall? I
Obama's
did not
picture,
know
right?
that.
The whole thing, 'cause I was at the
I did not
inauguration.
know
I got
that.
pictures at the inauguration. I
Oh,
got all that right
wow.
there, right? So
Okay.
that doesn't happen.
That's new
But for
information.
that, do you remember back in the day, like my grandmother's house, there was a picture of MLK. You walk up in that house.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
My grandma's in Southside Chicago.
I guess he's
Shout out
like our
shout out to
modern
Chicago.
MLK,
Absolutely.
something
And
like
there
that
used to
for
be
a
a whole
lot of
picture of
us.
it, right?
MLK was not without critique during his
You
lifetime.
gotta
So
be
This is
willing to take it.
Discourse with Daryl and Demetria, a continuation of our conversations on the Diversity Different podcast.
In this episode of Discourse, we talk about how schools are adapting post-student for fair admission, the Supreme Court case that ended affirmative action. Let's talk.
for law school admissions, they go through the Law School Admissions Council. Now the Law School Admissions Council does not make that data available to law schools as they're selecting candidates. So it's basically blind, even if the student self-identifies race in some way in their application, they can. But as in including that data set either on their application or the LSAC's application, schools can no longer do that. As a result of SFFA, you have higher education institutions have shifted their admissions procedures quite drastically. I had a friend who is in admissions at the law school level, and she gave me a lot of insight into how their process has changed, and they've only had one full cycle since SFFA. They were luckily able to hold their diversity numbers pretty close to what they had prior. I think they were 31 or 32% before, and now they're down to like 29%. And that was a number that fluctuated for them anyway. So that's not an aberration. They are pretty proud that they've been able to hold it there. But she talked to me about how their process is different. And I found it really interesting. She said what they did, and I think a lot of schools, and she affirmed this from what she's been hearing at conferences and talking to the people in her circles, what they've done is added more questions to the application so that they can glean diversity from other ways and just look at the application in a different way. So they have questions that are more directly related to obstacles, hardship,
There you go.
problem solving, those kinds of things. And they're able to sometimes capture the diversity through those means.
So I was on a panel with a dean from a law school, and SFFA was part of the discussion on that panel. And he articulated what I know and understand a significant number of schools' position is and was. That first of all, it's a law school. They kind of know what the law has been and where it's going. It's what we do for a living. And so they could see the writing on the wall for years beforehand. And so his response when we were at this panel was, we had to do nothing different, right? We knew this is where it was heading. So we'd already eliminated the obvious. And like you said, there's other ways to ask questions. And to the dismay of, I'm sure, many who helped put Justice Roberts on, Chief Justice Roberts on, and many of a certain political persuasion, Justice Roberts articulated in the opinion, there's nothing to stop somebody from saying on their application how race played a role. He said in the opinion, hey, that's perfectly fine to talk about. So if you ask enough questions in a variety of ways, you can still get a sense. And this dean talked about how while you cannot ask race at the application stage, you can voluntarily ask for it after admission.
So you
many
can
students
look at it for matriculation
So
purposes.
you still
and
know
whatnot.
what your classes look like, because that was a question from the audience. Well, how do you know what the demographics are? Because we voluntarily say,
You
if you
just
guys
can't
want to put it
consider
on
it
there.
in admissions decisions.
Right. And that's
Yeah.
what people need to understand the limitations of SFFA is. And that's one of the biggest problems behind people talking about it is they're like, SFFA killed it for everything, everywhere, all times. And they don't understand the nuances, and especially the implications for DEI.
And one thing my friend said, it is harder, but the result has been that she has to look more deeply at applications to find the diversity and not necessarily to find the diversity, but to find the things that tend to lend itself to diversity, right? So in adding those 5 questions to the application, they get a deeper look at candidates now.
Right. Right.
One thing that we talked about and that I think she agreed with, what it's still going to largely depend on the ideology of the admissions committee in higher education. Because just like prior to SFFA, if the person on the admissions committee deems diversity important, they're going to look deeply into the application to find it, right?
Right.
Or to at least find the characteristics that they want to see, like grit, problem solving. They're going to look for those things. If the
Right.
person is more traditionally metric based,
Right.
then that same person prior to SFFA, we're probably going to make their decision largely based on metrics, and they're
Right.
not going to stop doing that. And
Right.
so the agreement that I think we came to is that the compositions of admissions committees matters now
Yeah.
just as it did before, and
Absolutely.
maybe even more now, because you have to look at more deeply at the application in order to find the characteristics that you want for your entering class.
To track that and give a little bit of credence to President Roosevelt, the buck stops here, right? It goes to the top. That's a dean function. A dean of a law school
Mhm,
has to be the first one that said this is important to this law
mhm.
school, right? And assigning the committee, the head of admissions, all of that goes back to the dean saying this is important to the law school that I'm running. And so
Yeah.
I agree completely with you, and I just want to extend it further up the ladder.
Yeah, and I think to extend it even further than that, that's also consistent with, like, hiring. When we put together these hiring committees, admissions committees, the ideology of those committees and who's on it matters, right? And it's
Yes.
not to say that the committee needs to look one way, and quite the contrary. You
Right.
want the people who are more interested in metrics and
Yes.
who are all about the metrics, but you also want
Yes.
the people on the committee that'll look at an application more broadly for other characteristics as they
Preach.
are needed in the organization, right? And
Right.
nothing about SFFA stops a committee on hiring or admissions from doing that.
I think SFFA result is exactly what your friend said. It requires more time. It requires more effort. The schools, the institutions that are still dedicated to creating a diverse student body and ultimately creating a diverse workforce of lawyers are still going to do the work. They're going to put in the time. They're
Mhm.
going to put in the effort. They're
Right.
going to do the things we just finished talking about. I don't think SFFA does any more than what you've already talked about earlier and what your friend pointed out. It requires a deeper involvement and commitment on the part of the institutions. Um,
Mhm.
Great. What we hope to see is a workforce that represents the population and can support,
Mhm.
represent the population. That's kind of the effort of it. The outcome of SFFA, I think, is nothing more than that. Other than it also created a atmosphere of fear. And that is without a doubt strategic. If you make folks
Mhm.
afraid in any society across any variety of platforms, they tend to shrink back. And that's what we're seeing is even institutions that aren't directed by SFFA start getting afraid and they start reacting in ways that the law doesn't say you have to do, but
Mhm.
yours says do it so that they don't come and harm you. They don't come and hurt you. As long as a group finds fear in others, they will continue to capitalize on that because they can keep pushing you. It's like the bully syndrome. They'll just keep pushing you further and further and further back. And you acquiescing to the first thing they say
Mhm.
doesn't stop them from saying the second thing they're going to say. And now you got to acquiesce to that. And that's going to lead to the
Right.
third thing they're going to say. And now you got to acquiesce from that. And I see that continually happening. And that's why we talked earlier about what are your values? What are your morals? What are your stances? What are you willing to fight for? Because once you start showing that you're not going to fight,
This Harvard decision has made a difference at elite schools. For example, Harvard only enrolled 3.4% or 19 first-year Black law students, which is the lowest number they've had since the 1960s, since that's our data set we're looking at. This was the lowest number of students since then, had less than half of the 43 students they had in 2023.
right.
So this is their lowest number since 1965.
Yep.
Harvard undergraduate has also seen a decrease, not as substantial, But for first year undergraduate students, it fell to 14% for Black first year undergraduate students from 18% in
Right.
2023.
Right.
There's also been a drop in other demographics, including Hispanic and Native American students.
Right.
And then you've got other schools, just looking at law schools again, like Columbia, New York, who also saw slight drops in Black enrollment from 48% to 42%. So, in terms of elite schools, it seems like SFFA has made a big difference. It was no mistake that Harvard was where conservative anti-affirmative action groups focused. It's not a surprise
Right.
because that's where the most movement was expected to happen.
The reason that you're going to see direction of attacks at Harvard is Cheryl Harris's law review article, right? Whiteness is property. And the
Mhm,
property interest is the degree from Harvard. That is a property
mhm,
interest. And so for those of you who want
absolutely.
to dive deep, read Cheryl Harris's article. She does a great job of illuminating that property interest and why you go after Harvard first. The dean of the law school that I was on the panel with, who talked about the reason it hit Harvard and elite schools the hardest is because historically they had to work the least hard to get those students. So
Mhm.
this dean is at a school that's not an elite school. Students that
Yeah,
you're
because the
dealing
other
with.
schools just recruited by name,
Right. All I got to do is say I'm Harvard.
and if you get in, you going.
Right. And I used to, when I
Right.
was recruiting, when I was out on that circuit, doing LSAC forums and all that, I would often talk to a student who would automatically tell me their numbers. And I knew just from the first words out, they were not going to get into Harvard. But they'd say things like, well, I only want to go to law school if I can get into Harvard or Yale. I'm like, that's just not the reality. And they don't understand the reality of the whole situation. But that is the mentality. So again, Harvard and Yale, the elites didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to put any work into it because they just said, I'm Harvard. And folks like, they open the door. Folks like, I'm coming. I'm getting together smaller data sets that suggest the schools that aren't as highly ranked have already been doing this work. And so it's not hitting
That
them
makes
the same
sense. This is one reason why when I was in DEI in the school, so much of what I wanted to do was focused on pipelining,
way.
because I always felt like we were all competing for the same group of diverse students. We
Hmm.
weren't
Hmm. Hmm.
expanding that pool. And that
Yes.
same group of students, they're all gonna go to the best school that they can go
Uh-huh.
to,
Uh-huh.
but they're going to go to a law school. And so if we really wanna talk about diversifying the legal profession
Right.
specifically, then we need to reach back way further than the admissions point in affirmative action policies because we're all just switching out.
I completely agree with her.
And then the other thing that I will throw into the conversation is there are people who are saying that this is proof of mismatch theory,
Uh,
right? That these students are going to the schools they were supposed to go
Okay, so I
to.
have a response to that at a variety of levels. The mismatch theory, in and of itself, was constructed by a law professor who, by the vast amount of mismatch theory, that professor took a set of data that was not prepared to do the things that he ultimately did with it. In other words, bad data in, but I've got a great conclusion coming out, right?
Right. Right.
And what bothers me most is, and I am going to throw this name out there because this is a pop culture name, Malcolm Gladwell. I used to read a
Mhm.
lot of Malcolm Gladwell books. I'm throwing this out there. So Malcolm catches this, you know. And those of y'all reading Malcolm Gladwell, you know. He threw out mismatch theory in one of his books. And I was reading Gladwell up until I hit that book. And when I saw him mention it, I saw that he only mentioned it from the perspective of that law professor that we've been talking about, not from
Mhm.
the dozens of other articles that said, here's the problem with this analysis and why it's weak and
Mhm.
why it's wrong. And I
Mhm.
decided on that moment, if Malcolm Gladwell is citing to something without saying there is a massive amount of research that says
Mhm.
the exact opposite, Malcolm Gladwell is either intentionally denying the reader the fact of, oh, you need to know this is out there, either that. So you've intentionally doing it, or he's ignorant about
Mm.
this being out there.
Either
And
way.
in a way, I'm done, right? I'm done
Mhm.
with you
Yeah.
because you.
What's the problem with mismatch theory? Because like I said, I think that people are gonna run with what's happening at Harvard and say that, well, they're at the schools that they should have been at. They're still
True.
going to get to go to a law school, because if you could get into Harvard, there are dozens of other law schools that you can go to. So why did those students deserve a chance? What is your response to that as to why that's wrong?
So to say they didn't deserve to go to Harvard again challenges this idea of what we're calling merit anyway. Like who deserves to get into Harvard at all? Like what's the metric that we're going to use? Then we got to
Mhm,
go into the whole history of standardized testing, which is a whole nother episode
mhm,
as well.
mhm.
So before somebody says they didn't deserve to go, I got to start like breaking down that, well, who deserves
We
to
gotta
go?
dissect merit.
Right.
Yeah,
We got to, it's like, Mary, we're going to say
yeah.
deserves, right? Like how are we even deciding who
Mhm,
deserves to go at all?
mhm,
So that's my first issue. The numbers tend to suggest, especially at Harvard, that entry into Harvard is the only real barrier. Most folks that get into Harvard are going to graduate from Harvard. And if the other metric for success, which is the mismatch theory challenges whether they're successful. If
mhm,
graduation from Harvard is successful, then the metric says they did deserve to be there. And that's exactly where they should
mhm.
have been because they did succeed by graduating.
Right.
And the reason these folks wanted to go to Harvard is the same reason that whiteness of property exists, because Harvard has cachet. You're going to
Mhm.
get offers to do things simply as a Harvard graduate, period. Simply as a
Absolutely.
Harvard graduate that comes from few of other places. Yale, maybe, right? Maybe Stanford, but there's few opportunities, few doors. There are not nearly as many doors that are going to open when you graduate from a law school than you do from Harvard. That's why
Yeah,
every
you walk into Harvard, you gonna walk out and through whatever door you want to, and that's
absolutely,
just that's the real.
that's the reality.
The other philosophical question, which I think Derek Bell would ask is, did we do ourselves any favors with affirmative action? These philosophical questions probably didn't matter at one time, but as we think about moving into the future of DEI, I think we have to think about things like interest conversion theory and whether we're doing ourselves any favors with policies like affirmative action when, as you just pointed out, when as soon as the balance of power sees fit to smashing it down, that's what it's going to do.
We cannot think that there's some magical panacea. Like there's no pill that's going to solve all of this. And so when you say, did we do ourselves more harm than good? I think we did ourselves both good and harm. But
Mm,
for the things we've been talking about today,
mhm,
you ever see a President Obama? You don't have a picture. I got the
mm,
picture right up over there.
mhm.
Y'all can look at the wall. There's President Obama
You
right
got
there.
Obama's picture on the
No,
wall? I
Obama's
did not
picture,
know
right? I
that.
got the whole thing because I was at the
I did not
inauguration.
know
I got
that.
pictures at the inauguration. I
Oh,
got all that right
wow.
there, right? So
Okay.
that doesn't happen.
That's new
But for
information.
that, I'm telling you, come on over, girl. I'll show you right up in this joint. Like
I
that's
believe you. I really
you
do
remember
believe
back in
you.
the day, do you remember back in the day, like my grandmother's house, there was a picture of MLK. You walk up in their house.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
grandma's
He's
in
our
South Side Chicago.
I guess he's
Shout out
like our
shout out to
modern
Chicago.
MLK,
Absolutely. And
something
there,
like
there
that
used to
for
be
a
a whole
lot of
picture of
us.
it, right?
MLK was not without critique during his lifetime. So,
You gotta be willing to
yeah.
take the critique as well. Pros and the cons, right?
Bernice King, I loved it on MLK Day. She kind of went off. She was like, "Half of y'all ain't even like my daddy." Like,
You're
I
right
loved it.
though,
I was like, "She is
right?
real." Now
She's
that
real.
was half of
Thank
y'all ain't
you.
even like him. Half of y'all that roll his words off your tongue go around and do the thing diametrically opposed to that as soon as you get a chance. And so
I mean,
stop playing.
post that
Get her daddy name out your
out your
mouth
mouth.
is what she said. I still feel like we might need to come back and do some kind of an affirmative action episode. We might want to do it through some other specific lens, but there's so much that we cusply
Right,
unpacked
right.
and could have unpacked in so many other ways. But I want to
Thank
move
you for
into
joining us on this episode of Discourse. You can catch the full conversation that sparked this one on the Diversity Different podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.